jury has found former White House strategist Steve Bannon guilty on charges of contempt of Congress. Deliberations lasted only a few hours. The former Trump aide was on trial after refusing a subpoena from the House January 6th committee. He now faces up to 2 years in prison. Bannon spoke to reporters outside the courthouse after the verdict.
We may have lost a battle here today, but we're not going to lose this war. In the closing argument, the prosecutor missed one very important phrase, right? I stand with Trump and the Constitution, and I will never back off that, ever.
CBS News congressional correspondent Scott MacFarlane has been covering this case, and he joins us now. So, Scott, you have been covering this story, as we said. You were there at the courthouse when Steve Bannon spoke. We know at times that there have been both supporters of Steve Bannon and protesters there. What was it like at the courthouse when that verdict was announced?
Don't let the noise fool you. Just a few of each, a few supporters, a few detractors. What stood out to me, Elaine, is the trial was short and the deliberations were shorter. Steve Bannon didn't muster a defense. He didn't take the stand to testify in his own defense. He didn't present witnesses, didn't present evidence, didn't present exhibits. He didn't present a case. All they gave was closing arguments in his defense. It happened today. The jury got the case just before lunchtime. Presumably they ate the lunch. And before 3 p.m. Washington, D.C. time, they already had their verdict. Guilty on both counts of contempt of Congress for defying the subpoena of the January 6th Select Committee. You see Steve Bannon walking out. You played a clip of him a moment ago. I asked him what became of his promise that this was going to be the, quote, misdemeanor from hell. His defense attorney, David Schoen, interjected before Bannon could respond and said there will be an appeal. They'll appeal this case. But they were laying the groundwork from the start. They were talking throughout this week about things they wanted on the record for the likely looming appeal. But that notwithstanding, Elaine, he's set to be sentenced October 19th at 3 p.m., facing a maximum 2 years in prison.
Well, Scott, remind us of the context here. Why did Steve Bannon just not comply with the January 6th committee's subpoena?
He had made a series of arguments explaining why he wasn't complying, but none of those, or at least very few of those, were allowed to be entered into the arguments at trial. He had claimed there was a form of privilege that Donald Trump had invoked, precluding him from testifying. In fact, he brought that argument to the courthouse steps after the trial today. Thing is, the judge wouldn't let that be entered into evidence for a couple of reasons. The judge said, first of all, there's no evidence provided to the court, at least not sufficient evidence, that Donald Trump ever invoked privilege for Steve Bannon. What's more, they said the privilege isn't really relevant to the, you got a subpoena, there's a firm deadline, you have to honor it. Even if you're to go in person and plead the fifth or invoke privilege in front of the committee, you still have to go in front of the committee. He didn't do it. He was intransigent on that ever since October, until the 11th hour, Elaine, till just before his trial, when he finally made an offer to appear before the committee. The Justice Department responded that it wasn't genuine. He was just trying to lighten the load or soften the ground ahead of a trial at which he was convicted quite quickly by 12 D.C. jurors.
Well, Scott, you outlined the legal arguments from the Bannon defense team. Do we have a sense now of the time frame for their appeal?
Yeah, they'll likely try to appeal ahead of sentencing so that they can, what's called, stay the sentencing, delay the sentencing in perpetuity while the appeals are heard. I asked the defense lawyer if he's considering doing that. Didn't respond. But in many of these cases, when you're trying to lay the groundwork for an appeal, you want to hold off on the sentencing until the appeal's heard, and oftentimes judges will accept that. It's a pretty tight turnaround. The sentencing is set for about 3 months from today, October 21st. There's time needed in the federal system for both sides to file sentencing memos for a pre-sentence report. There are firm federal guidelines into which some of these cases fall. But his case is distinctive. It's a misdemeanor. But there's a mandatory minimum, 30 days for contempt of Congress. There's a maximum, 1 year in prison for contempt of Congress. So his appeals notwithstanding, Steve Bannon is destined for some period of time in a federal prison.
All right, Scott MacFarlane on Capitol Hill covering this case for us. Scott, thank you very much.
Thank you.